Alice never intended to find herself in such a storm of emotions. She was a sharp, pragmatic lawyer, married to Nick for nearly 10 years, her life revolving around courtroom battles, late-night research, and Nick's unwavering companionship. They had a rhythm, a predictable cadence built on shared values and mutual respect, albeit not much excitement. Life had settled into a pattern of comfort, if not thrill, which suited Alice's need for stability, until Carter entered her world. Carter Sullivan was the new executive at her firm, introduced at a company-wide meeting to a chorus of polite applause. But when he took the stage, Alice felt a rush she hadn't experienced in years. He was tall, with dark hair that framed a clean-shaven, angular face, and he carried himself with a confidence that bordered on magnetic. His charisma seemed effortless, and as he spoke, the entire room seemed drawn in, mesmerized. Alice could feel her pulse quicken, her mind racing with thoughts she knew she shouldn't entertain. It started innocently enough. Alice's law firm had been working on a particularly high-profile case, and her senior partner, recognizing her dedication, assigned her as Carter's lead advisor. Her heart pounded at the news, though she dismissed it as simple professional enthusiasm. Still, when they first met alone in the firm's glass-walled conference room, Alice could barely control the faint tremor in her voice. Carter's eyes met hers with a sharp intelligence, softened by a trace of amusement, as if he knew the effect he had on people. She noticed he held her gaze just a moment too long, the air thickening with unspoken tension. From that moment, it became difficult for Alice to ignore her attraction. Their work required late nights, sometimes taking place in the dimly lit meeting rooms, where they sat close, exchanging ideas and strategies in hushed tones. Carter was more than just handsome. He was perceptive, occasionally brushing her hand as he pointed something out on her laptop. These subtle touches, though accidental, ignited a quiet storm in her, a spark that she hadn't felt in years. She knew she should resist, yet her resolve weakened each time he leaned close, his cologne mixing with the faint aroma of her coffee, wrapping her in a cocoon of intrigue and desire. One evening, after yet another grueling strategy session that stretched well past normal office hours, they both headed out of the building together. The city lights cast a soft glow over the darkened streets, and Alice tried to ignore how Carter's presence by her side felt strangely intimate, almost as if they were the only two people in the world. At the firm's entrance, he turned to her, his gaze intense, and hesitated as if he had something to say. Alice's breath caught, her thoughts racing between propriety and a dangerous yearning she had only felt once before years ago, and never with her husband. Just as she opened her mouth to say goodnight, Carter took a step closer. "I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you, Alice," he murmured, his voice a low, velvety whisper. Alice felt herself lean in, but then a rush of guilt hit her, and she forced herself to pull back, mumbling a hurried goodbye before walking away, her heart pounding as she retreated into the night. At home, Nick was waiting for her, his warm smile a painful reminder of the stability they'd built together. He asked about her day, the new executive, the latest developments at the firm. Alice replied in carefully chosen words, glossing over the raw confusion that Carter had awakened in her. She convinced herself it was nothing, a fleeting attraction that would fade as quickly as it had appeared. But Carter proved impossible to ignore. He seemed to be everywhere, appearing casually at her door in the mornings, leaning over her desk with some new point of discussion, his tone flirtatious yet always veiled enough to be ambiguous. The tipping point came at a firm event 2 weeks later. Alice had told herself she would keep her distance, that she would make an excuse to leave early. But the allure of Carter's presence was undeniable, and as they locked eyes from across the room, she felt the world blur around them. He raised a glass in her direction, and she felt herself blush, something she hadn't done since her 20s. The night progressed, and soon enough, they found themselves standing on the balcony, away from the noise and prying eyes. "It's beautiful out here," Carter said, his voice soft as he looked out over the city lights. But Alice could see his gaze wasn't on the view. It was on her, studying her intently. Her pulse raced, her rational mind drowned by the sound of her own heartbeat. She knew she should walk away, but every fiber of her being resisted. As if reading her thoughts, Carter reached out, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Alice, you don't have to pretend. I think you feel it too. His words washed over her, unraveling the last thread of her resistance. Alice felt a cascade of emotions overwhelm her: desire, guilt, confusion, and an aching need for the connection she had been suppressing for so long. She knew she was dancing on the edge of a precipice, yet in that moment, it was all she wanted. But then, the flash of her phone vibrating in her bag snapped her back to reality. It was a message from Nick. Just wanted to say goodnight, hope you're having fun. The gentle reminder of her husband's love brought her crashing down, filling her with shame. Alice pulled away, her voice a shaky whisper. I can't, Carter. This isn't right. She took a step back, almost as if to distance herself from her own feelings. Carter's face softened, his gaze one of understanding, yet she couldn't ignore the flicker of disappointment. I get it, he said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. But if you ever change your mind, he left the words hanging, giving her a slight nod before heading back inside, leaving Alice standing alone, her heart pounding, and a storm of emotions swirling within her. The next morning, Alice felt the weight of her turmoil heavier than ever. She tried to distract herself with work, throwing herself into case files and client calls, but Carter's presence was impossible to ignore. As he walked past her office, he gave her a fleeting glance, the intensity of his eyes sparking a silent acknowledgement of the moment they'd shared. Alice felt an ache of longing she hadn't anticipated, a battle raging between duty and desire, love and the thrill of the unknown. Yet, beneath her guilt, she couldn't deny the intoxicating allure of Carter's magnetism, a force she felt pulling her, tempting her to explore a side of herself that had lain dormant for far too long. And as she faced her reflection that evening, the question lingered, haunting her. Was she truly ready to let go of everything she had built with Nick, or was this just a passing infatuation, destined to fade as all forbidden desires eventually do? In the days following their encounter on the balcony, Alice felt the weight of her own thoughts closing in on her. Carter's presence in the office had grown more prominent, more deliberate. She would catch him glancing at her, his eyes lingering, his smile unmistakably playful. His voice seemed to carry a subtle, intimate tone whenever he spoke to her, even in front of others. It was as if they shared a secret that no one else could see, a private current sparking and building tension between them. Alice told herself she'd resist. She'd remind herself each morning of Nick's steady, reliable love. But the thrill that Carter brought into her life, the intensity of his attention, was far harder to shake than she had anticipated. One Monday morning, Alice walked into her office to find a small gift on her desk, a single, crimson rose and a handwritten note. Her heart skipped as she recognized Carter's handwriting. The note read, "For someone who brightens the darkest of meetings." She swallowed, glancing around to ensure no one had seen it. Her fingers traced the petals absently, her heart pounding. She knew she should toss it, but instead, she slid it discreetly into her drawer, the rose hidden behind her files. This tiny act of concealment felt like a betrayal, yet it also gave her an unfamiliar thrill. During a team briefing later that day, Carter positioned himself directly across from her. His leg brushed hers under the table, an intentional but fleeting contact. She tensed, aware of his proximity, his faint cologne mixing with the sterile office air. As the meeting droned on, his gaze drifted toward her, his expression daring. When she finally looked up, their eyes met, and he raised an eyebrow, giving her a barely perceptible smile that made her cheeks flush. By the time the meeting ended, Alice's resolve had weakened. As she gathered her things, Carter casually leaned in, speaking low enough so that only she could hear. "Join me for lunch today," he said, his voice a soft invitation that left no room for decline. Before she could respond, he slipped away, leaving her conflicted and breathless. At noon, she found herself sitting across from Carter at an upscale restaurant she'd never been to. The atmosphere was intimate, dim lights, quiet jazz music, and a view of the city skyline that made the moment feel far removed from the office. They talked about work at first, exchanging updates on their case, but soon the conversation grew more personal. He asked about her life, her dreams, even her regrets. Alice found herself opening up, sharing parts of herself she hadn't revealed in years, not even to Nick. There was an ease between them, a natural chemistry that left her feeling exposed yet alive. She knew she should hold back, but the temptation was undeniable, the draw irresistible. Over the next few weeks, Carter's advances became more audacious. He would leave notes on her desk, small, folded messages that she would find tucked in her files, or slipped between her legal briefs. Each one was more daring than the last. "Thinking about you," one read, while another said, "Let's escape this place. I know somewhere you'd love." The thrill of his attention became a secret indulgence, one that she craved more with each passing day. She started to find herself lingering in his office longer than necessary, laughing at his jokes, letting their conversations drift away from work. One evening, during a company networking event, Carter suggested a game. "Let's pretend we don't know each other," he whispered in her ear as they stood in a crowded room filled with executives and associates. She shot him a wary glance, but his mischievous smile pulled her in. They spent the evening on opposite sides of the room, exchanging glances, playing out a secret narrative, until finally he approached her as if for the first time. Extending his hand, he introduced himself with exaggerated formality, making her laugh. It was a silly game, but one that made her feel like they were the only two people in the room. She realized with a pang of guilt that she hadn't felt this way in years. After the event, as they walked together through the empty halls of the firm, Carter paused, pulling her gently to a stop. The building was quiet, their footsteps echoing in the dimly lit corridor. He leaned in, his hand brushing her cheek, and murmured, "You know you don't have to keep pretending, Alice." His voice was soft, tinged with a sincerity that caught her off guard. She felt her heart race, her mind clouded by desire and the forbidden allure of his touch. But just as she leaned into him, her phone buzzed, snapping her out of the moment. It was Nick, calling to check in, his familiar voice grounding her, bringing her back to reality. She pulled away, mumbling a quick apology and leaving Carter standing alone in the corridor, his expression one of quiet resignation. Back home, Alice tried to shake the memory of that near kiss, but the guilt gnawed at her. She avoided Carter the next day, determined to set boundaries. But he was relentless, sending her a text during a break, lunch. She ignored it, burying herself in work, only to find him waiting for her outside her office at the end of the day. "Alice," he began, his tone a mixture of frustration and tenderness. "I know this isn't easy for you, but I can't pretend that nothing's happening here." She felt her defenses crumble, her resolve weakening. She knew she should walk away, but instead she found herself reaching out, her hand brushing his, a silent acknowledgement of the growing temptation she could no longer deny. That night, Alice's mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The line between right and wrong was blurring, and she found herself thinking less of her vows to Nick and more of the thrill Carter had awakened in her. Her heart ached with the intensity of her desires, her loyalty to Nick feeling like an anchor she was tempted to unmoor. The following week, the firm organized a weekend retreat, and Alice found herself paired with Carter on various assignments. They spent hours together, working late into the night on presentations and proposals, the proximity only intensifying the tension between them. One evening, as they worked in Carter's hotel room, he reached over, tucking a stray strand of her hair behind her ear. The gentle touch sent shivers down her spine, and for a moment, she allowed herself to lean into it, the allure of his touch overpowering her sense of duty. When their project was complete, they decided to celebrate with a late dinner, slipping away to a nearby restaurant. As they shared a bottle of wine, their conversation turned increasingly personal. Carter reached across the table, taking her hand in his thumb tracing soft circles on her skin. Alice felt her breath hitch, her heart pounding as he gazed at her with an intensity that left her feeling bare, exposed. "Alice," he murmured, his voice soft yet steady. "I know this isn't easy for you, but life is too short to deny yourself what you truly want." His words hung in the air, each one a temptation, a beckoning toward a path she knew she shouldn't follow. Yet, as she looked into his eyes, she found herself captivated, the world around them fading until all she could feel was the warmth of his hand, the depth of his gaze. That night, alone in her hotel room, Alice lay awake, haunted by the memory of his touch, the unspoken promise in his words. She knew she was at a crossroads, her heart torn between loyalty and desire, security and the thrill of the unknown. The temptation had taken root, growing deeper, consuming her thoughts, leaving her wondering if she could truly resist the allure of the forbidden path laid out before her. Alice had practiced this conversation a dozen times in her head, crafting words that might soften the impact, though she doubted it would work. She had always known Nick as level-headed, the kind of man who measured every response. But as she approached him now, her heart raced with a mix of fear and shame, the cold, hard edges of her thoughts scraping against her calm facade. It was late when she finally broached the subject. They were in their kitchen, the comforting hum of their familiar life around them, the click of the refrigerator door as Nick grabbed a drink, the gentle clink as he placed his glass on the counter. She knew there'd be no easy way to bring it up, no perfect moment, but she had to do it now or she never would. "Nick," she started, her voice softer than she intended, "I need to talk to you about something serious." He looked up, his face still warm from the casual conversation they'd been having. But he sensed her tone shift and placed his glass down, watching her intently. Alice took a breath, her eyes darting toward the window as if the view outside might provide courage. "There's something I've been struggling with. It's about someone at work." Nick's brow furrowed slightly, a hint of concern flashing across his face. "Is everything okay?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Alice felt her heart sink. She hated seeing worry cross his face, and she cursed herself for what she was about to say. "Yes, it's just complicated." She paused, her mouth dry. She forced herself to meet his gaze, her words trembling as she continued. "It's Carter, my new colleague. Well, I can't seem to get him out of my head." The room fell silent, Nick's face unreadable. She could see a flicker of confusion, and then, almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightened. "What exactly are you saying, Alice?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a gravity she had only heard a few times before. Her hands fidgeted as she spoke, words tumbling out in a mess of explanations and justifications she knew wouldn't make sense. I didn't mean for it to happen. But Carter, he's different. He makes me feel something I haven't felt in so long." She watched as Nick's face shifted, his expression growing darker. Her heart pounded as she pressed on, words spilling out faster now. "I'm drawn to him, Lou. I know it sounds selfish, but there's a part of me that wants to be with him, just briefly." Nick's silence was chilling. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, trying to find something that might explain this. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "So, let me get this straight. You're asking me for permission to have an affair?" The directness of his words was like a slap. Alice had expected him to be angry, but not this blunt. She hesitated, tears welling up as she nodded. "Yes, I suppose I am. But it's not like I want to leave you, Nick. Just something I need to get out of my system before we start a family." She trailed off, her voice barely a whisper, the weight of her request sinking into the room like lead. Nick's face hardened, his gaze unwavering. "And what exactly do you expect me to feel about that?" His tone was measured, but she could hear the hurt lacing his words. "How am I supposed to support you in this?" "I know it's unfair," Alice replied, her voice breaking. "I know it sounds cruel, but this isn't about you or our life together. I love you. I don't want anyone else forever. She struggled to find the words, realizing how hollow they sounded, even to herself. Nick shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. He stood up, running his hand through his hair, pacing the kitchen in silence. Alice could see the turmoil churning inside him, his mind racing as he processed her confession. "So, you want me to stand by, knowing you're with someone else? Knowing that I'm here, just waiting for you to get this, whatever it is, out of your system?" Alice flinched at his words, the harshness of them cutting through her justifications. "I don't expect you to understand," she whispered. "But I thought if I could be honest with you." "Honest?" he interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Alice, I thought honesty was talking about things before you got involved with someone else. Not telling me after you've already." His words trailed off, but the accusation hung in the air, undeniable. The accusation jolted her, and she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to him. "No, Nick, it hasn't gone that far. I'm telling you now because I wanted to be open with you, to figure this out together. Nick held up his hand, stopping her in her tracks. His voice grew quieter, but it was clear, each word heavy with disbelief and betrayal. How can you expect me to be okay with this? How can you stand here, in our home, and tell me that I'm supposed to let you be with him, even briefly? The silence that followed was suffocating, the weight of her confession pressing down on them both. Nick looked away, his expression hardening as he stared out the window. Maybe I was wrong about us, Alice, he finally said, his voice barely audible. Alice's heart shattered at his words, but she forced herself to keep going. She had to say it all, no matter how painful it was. Nick, don't you ever wonder what it would be like? To feel that spark again, to experience something new? Nick's gaze snapped back to her, his eyes narrowing. I've spent every day trying to make this work with you, Alice. I chose us over and over again. And you're asking me to take a step back so you can chase a fantasy? Alice's lips quivered as she tried to respond, but the truth of his words hit her harder than anything she'd prepared for. She felt a surge of shame wash over her, mingling with the guilt she'd been carrying. I never wanted to hurt you, she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. But I thought, maybe if I could just have this one chance, we could move past it. Start fresh. Nick shook his head slowly, his face a mix of pain and anger. You don't get to shatter something and then ask me to help you pick up the pieces. He looked at her, his voice thick with emotion. If this is really what you want, maybe you need to decide if it's worth losing everything we've built. Alice's breath hitched, the reality of his words slicing through her. She had thought she could navigate this, that Nick's love for her might somehow allow them to find a way forward. But she could see now that her request had torn at the very foundation of their relationship, leaving scars that she might never be able to heal. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Nick turned away from her, his face set, the warmth and trust that had defined their marriage replaced by an icy distance. And as Alice stood there, the full weight of her choices pressing down on her, she realized that the path she had taken had led her to a place she might never be able to return from. Do what you want, Alice, Nick finally said, his voice cold and detached. But don't expect me to be here when you're done. With that, he walked out of the kitchen, leaving her alone in the silence, the echo of his words lingering in the air. And as Alice stood there, the reality of her decision settling in, she felt a hollow emptiness that no brief affair could ever fill. Alice packed lightly for her weekend with Carter, her hands trembling as she zipped the small bag. Her thoughts were tangled, a knot of nerves, excitement, guilt, and a touch of fear. She had never envisioned herself doing something like this, yet here she was, preparing to leave the home she shared with Nick for an entire weekend with another man. She pushed thoughts of Nick to the back of her mind, though his last words echoed painfully. She'd convinced herself this weekend would somehow bring her clarity, an answer to her turmoil. Carter picked her up just after work on Friday. He was in his sleek black sedan, his usual confidence softened by the hint of a smile he saved just for her. As Alice slipped into the car, Carter leaned over, giving her a kiss that was far gentler than she'd expected, a touch that spoke of both passion and restraint. He drove them out of the city to a secluded coastal town, far from the familiar streets and people of their everyday lives. They arrived at a quaint, high-end inn overlooking the ocean. The inn was charming, with warm wooden interiors, candles flickering on every table, and views of the ocean stretching out endlessly. Their room was private, tucked away from the other guests, with a balcony that opened to the sound of crashing waves. As soon as the door closed behind them, Carter pulled her into his arms, his lips finding hers with an urgency that sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, she let herself be fully drawn into the moment, blocking out the consequences that waited for her back home. The weekend unfolded in a haze of indulgence. Carter took her to dinner at a cozy seaside restaurant, the ambience filled with soft music and laughter. They shared stories of their lives, their childhood dreams, their unfulfilled ambitions. Carter revealed sides of himself she hadn't seen at the office. His love of poetry, his failed attempt at a career in music, even a longing to live in Italy one day. Alice found herself captivated by these glimpses of his life, each one deepening the allure of this man who had managed to upend everything she thought she knew. Back at the inn, the intensity of their connection continued to build. They would lie on the balcony late at night, watching the moonlight dance on the waves, talking about life as if they had known each other forever. Each touch, each glance felt like an escape, a reprieve from her ordinary world. Carter would run his fingers through her hair, whispering soft words that seemed to melt her resolve, leaving her vulnerable in ways she hadn't anticipated. But even as she let herself sink into the experience, there were moments when reality crept in. Small details, the sight of Carter's phone buzzing on the nightstand or his habit of checking messages late at night, reminded her that he, too, had a life outside of this weekend, a world she did not belong to. She found herself wondering if he had any idea of the destruction she'd left behind, the relationship she'd jeopardized just to be here. But each time doubt surfaced, she pushed it aside, convincing herself that this was her only chance to explore a side of herself she had long buried. On Sunday afternoon, as they shared a final lunch by the water, Alice felt an odd pang of emptiness, a sense that something vital was slipping away. Carter, sensing her shift in mood, reached across the table and took her hand. "You seem far away," he said softly, his gaze probing hers. "I guess I'm just thinking," she replied, trying to smile, though her thoughts were turning back toward home, back toward Nick. She couldn't shake the feeling that, despite everything, a part of her still belonged there. Carter leaned forward, brushing his thumb along the back of her hand. "You don't have to go back to anything you don't want," he murmured, his words filled with an offer that felt both tempting and terrifying. But Alice only shook her head, pulling her hand back gently. She knew she couldn't avoid returning to her life forever. With a forced smile, she told him she had enjoyed their time together, though the words felt strangely hollow. The drive home was silent, a stark contrast to the charged energy of the weekend. Carter glanced at her occasionally as if trying to read her mind, but she kept her gaze fixed on the passing landscape, her heart heavy with a mix of longing and regret. When he dropped her off outside her house, he gave her a final lingering kiss, his hand resting on her cheek as if trying to hold on to her, to make this moment last. She forced herself to smile, to appear as if she was okay, though her mind was spinning with thoughts of Nick, of the reality she was about to face. As she stepped inside, the house felt eerily quiet. She expected to see Nick waiting for her, perhaps angry or hurt, but willing to talk. Instead, she was met with silence, an emptiness that felt almost unnatural. She called out his name, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. But there was no answer. It was then that she noticed a note on the kitchen counter. Her heart raced as she picked it up, recognizing Nick's handwriting immediately. The note was short, each word precise, as if he'd carefully chosen them to convey the weight of his emotions. "Alice, I needed time to think. I've gone to stay with my brother. I hope you found what you were looking for this weekend. But I don't know if I'll be here when you're done with your exploration. Take care of yourself." The note slipped from her hands, fluttering to the floor as the weight of his words sank in. She sank onto a chair, her chest tight with a grief she hadn't anticipated. She realized then that she had been clinging to the fantasy that she could have it all, that she could step outside her marriage briefly and return to a life that would remain unscathed. But now, the reality of what she had risked, what she had lost, loomed before her like a chasm. Alice wandered through the empty house, each room a reminder of the life she and Nick had built. Their framed photos lined the walls, their wedding day, vacations, family gatherings, all fragments of a life that now felt shattered. She could see the small signs of Nick's absence everywhere. The empty closet, the missing keys from the hook by the door, even his favorite mug missing from the shelf. Each absence cut deeper, a painful reminder of what her actions had cost. The hours passed in a blur as she sat alone in their living room, replaying every moment of the weekend with Carter and each choice that had led her to this point. She realized with a painful clarity that the thrill of her affair had been fleeting, a temporary escape from the monotony of her life. But Nick's absence felt like a wound, a raw ache that left her hollow. That night, Alice lay in bed alone, staring up at the ceiling, the silence around her unbearable. She reached out instinctively to the empty side of the bed, her fingers brushing against the cold sheets where Nick should have been. The reality of his absence settled over her like a heavy weight, the full scope of her betrayal crystallizing in that empty space beside her. As she drifted into a restless sleep, her mind echoed with the memory of Nick's words, a haunting reminder that she might have lost the one person who had truly loved her. And for the first time, she felt the true gravity of her actions, the realization that she had sacrificed something irreplaceable for a fleeting temptation, leaving her standing alone in the aftermath of her choices. Alice awoke to the quiet hum of her empty home, her chest tightening as she reached for her phone, half expecting to see a message from Nick, a plea, a resolution, anything. But the screen was blank, the silence a reminder of the gaping void that now defined her life. She dragged herself out of bed, the memory of her weekend with Carter clinging to her like a shadow, filling her with a growing sense of dread. Each room she passed was a stark reminder of her choices, every corner holding memories of the life she and Nick had shared. She felt the sting of regret settle deeper, twisting with each step. In the kitchen, she spotted a folded note on the counter, the paper trembling slightly in her hand as she picked it up. Nick's handwriting was familiar, each letter precise yet softer than usual, as though he'd written it with a heavy heart. She took a breath, steeling herself as she unfolded it, her heart pounding as she read. Alice, I've had time to think, but the clarity I hoped to find only revealed the truth I tried to deny. I don't see us moving forward from this. It's clear you were searching for something I couldn't give you, and it would be selfish of me to keep you from finding it. I'm leaving to start over, to heal and rediscover myself. I hope you find whatever it was you needed, but I don't think I'll be here when you do. Take care. The words hit her like a blow, her breath catching as she reread the lines, each sentence carving deeper into her heart. She dropped the note, watching it flutter to the floor, the finality of his words searing into her mind. The man who had been her rock, her partner, was gone, and she was left to confront the wreckage of her choices alone. Alice sank into a chair, her mind racing back over every decision, every moment she'd spent with Carter. She had convinced herself it was an escape, a brief taste of freedom before settling down. But now, the thrill of those moments with Carter felt hollow, shallow, leaving her only with the pain of loss and a house that echoed with absence. Days drifted by in a haze, each one a repeat of the last. She moved mechanically, going to work, pretending everything was fine. People at the firm noticed her withdrawal. Her assistant Sarah even asked if she was all right, her eyes filled with concern. Alice brushed it off with a strained smile, murmuring something about needing time to adjust to changes. She avoided Carter, ducking out of sight whenever she saw him in the office. She hadn't expected to feel this sense of emptiness, this hollow ache, and every time she saw his familiar face, the spark she'd once felt had dulled, replaced by a bitterness she hadn't anticipated. One evening, a month after Nick's departure, she was sitting alone on their living room couch, sifting through old photos on her phone. Each image was a reminder of what she'd lost, the laughter they'd shared, the quiet moments on lazy Sunday mornings, their anniversary dinners, and the small, simple gestures that had defined their love. In every photo, she could see the love in Nick's eyes, a warmth that now felt distant, irretrievable. She found herself texting him, fingers hovering over the keyboard, struggling to find the words. Nick, please. Can we just talk? I need to explain. She paused, her heart pounding, before hitting send. But as the hours ticked by with no response, the silence felt more suffocating than ever, her message left unread. She knew she had no right to expect a reply, but the emptiness of the unanswered text weighed on her. One afternoon, unable to bear the isolation any longer, she drove to Nick's brother, David's, house. She had only been there a handful of times, mostly for family gatherings or barbecues, where David and Nick would laugh over old stories and tease each other. She'd hoped to find Nick there, or at least to hear that he was doing all right. But when she knocked on the door, David answered with a guarded look, his eyes cool as he regarded her. Alice, he said, his voice flat, with a hint of weariness. What are you doing here? She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. I was hoping Nick might be here. I just need to talk to him. David's face tightened, his expression unreadable. He's not here, Alice. And to be honest, I think it's better if you don't look for him. He's been through a lot because of, he trailed off, as though struggling to hold back what he wanted to say. He's trying to move on. You need to respect that. His words stung, the reality of them cutting through her defenses. She opened her mouth to respond, to plead, but the look in David's eyes stopped her. He was shielding Nick from her, protecting his brother from the pain she had caused. Alice managed a weak nod, murmuring a quiet, "I understand," before turning back to her car, each step feeling heavier than the last. Back home, she found herself replaying every moment, every conversation with Nick in her mind, as though searching for an answer that would ease the weight of her regret. But there was nothing, no simple fix, no way to rewrite the choices she'd made. She was left to confront the stark reality that her search for freedom, for a fleeting thrill, had cost her the one person who had truly been there for her. One evening, as she sat by herself in their darkened living room, she received an unexpected call from her mother. Her mother's gentle voice filled the silence, asking how she was, whether everything was all right. Alice hesitated, then broke down, the months of bottled-up grief spilling out. She told her mother everything: the affair, Nick's departure, the emptiness that had taken over her life. Her mother listened quietly, offering few words but staying on the line until Alice's sobs subsided. "It's going to be okay, Alice," her mother said softly. "Sometimes we lose ourselves along the way. But you'll find your way back. It's not the end, it's a beginning, even if it doesn't feel like one now." After the call, Alice sat in the stillness of her empty home, her mother's words echoing in her mind. She couldn't shake the guilt, the loneliness, but slowly she felt a glimmer of something else, a faint sense of resolve. She knew she couldn't change the past, couldn't undo the choices that had led her here. But maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to heal, to rebuild a life from the fragments of her old one. In the weeks that followed, she began to take small steps. She started therapy, facing the emotions she had spent so long avoiding. She reached out to old friends, reconnecting with people she had drifted away from. And little by little, she started to redefine herself, not as someone's wife or a career woman, but as herself, slowly piecing together who she wanted to be, apart from the roles she had so long inhabited. Yet, in the quiet moments, she still missed Nick. The sound of his laugh, the comfort of his presence, the sense of security that had once been her anchor. She knew there was no guarantee they would ever meet again, let alone find a way back to each other. But in those moments, she allowed herself to remember him, to feel the love they had once shared, even if only as a memory. And as Alice continued her journey, learning to live with both the loss and the possibility of renewal, she began to understand that her greatest challenge was not to forget Nick, but to forgive herself, to accept the pain of her choices and to find a way to move forward, one step at a time, toward whatever future lay ahead.